everyone, and welcome back to the Covey Wellness Center podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Joy Covey, and we are here today to have the final conversation, actually, of our season 3, where we've been talking to authors and looking at the intersection points between what they're writing about, their personal stories, and where that might be meeting the journeys of our listeners and their readers. And so today, I'm just thrilled to have Lisa-Jo Baker on the podcast with us. She has recently released a memoir called It Wasn't Roaring, It Was Weeping, which is a fantastic title. And I hope to talk a little bit more about that as well. And we're just thrilled to have her. Just a little bit about Lisa-Jo. She is, this is not her first rodeo with the book. She's written several other wonderful books, but this one I think stands alone in her collection as a unique narration of her own story related to some really difficult things. And I think that's where we're going to see how courageous and how vulnerable and how beautiful this story is and how hopeful it is. And so I'm excited to talk about that most recent book specifically. We have a couple of things in common. She's also a host of a podcast, which I understand is wrapping up, but has had some tremendous seasons with her dear friend, Christy Purifoy, called Out of the Ordinary. Lots of podcast material there for you to listen to and learn more and hear from Lisa-Jo as well. And we both started in English literature, which is also something in common. So I'm excited about that. And Lisa has had a varied career working in human rights fields, writing, speaking, teaching, being a mom, and talking about that. And so we're just so excited. She is originally from South Africa and is now living just outside Washington, D.C. So thank you so much again, Lisa, for joining. We're so glad you're here.
I am so thrilled to be with you guys.
So for those of you who may not be familiar, first of all, I will just tell you, this is a must summer read. You've got to go out and pick up a copy of this book to read. You will not be able to put it down. It's beautifully, beautifully written, but it's also just, my friend has a saying where she says that life is both brutal and beautiful. And so it's brutiful. And that is sort of the sense I have of this, which is that there's just some raw, honest humanity, but also this thread of hope and healing that's woven in the stories, in the scenes. I heard you say in another podcast that it unfolds kind of like a movie, scene to scene. And I think that's a very good way to describe the experience of reading this book. So before we get started, Lisa-Jo has given me the great privilege of reading a few of her words to start us off from the prologue in her book, just to set the tone. And then she's going to talk to us a little bit, pick up there and talk to us a little bit about the origin story, for this book and where that came from. So I'm just going to read a few words here in her beautiful script from page 9 of the prologue. He is 77. I am 50. I don't know what age you are. I don't know if you left when you should have stayed, hated when you should have forgiven, broke trust when you should have been faithful. But I do know what it feels like to believe you're too late, that there's been too much damage, that the only way forward is repeating where you came from, that you're too angry, too sad, too far gone for a rewrite. I know that very, very well. I hear it in my dad's voice and my worst 3 a.m. fears. I read it in the history of my motherland, South Africa, and the headlines of my adopted homeland, America. Regret is both individual and universal, personal and communal. And still, that is not the whole story. I want to tell you the whole story, or at least a more whole story.
Mm-hmm.
So beautiful.
Fun to hear somebody else read it.
Is it? I hope I did it justice. One of the things I'll tell the audience too is that I signed up for Audible to hear Lisa-Jo read this book. Like, I'm not usually an audiobook person, but I wanted to hear your pronunciation of all of the beautiful language that you use. And it just made it that much more personal to hear you literally speaking your story, orating your story. It was I would highly advise it. I had the book in hand and the audio in my ears and was like getting the best of both worlds. I was
Oh
really
my
into it.
gosh. I love that so much. And it's on Spotify too. So if you have Spotify, you can listen there, which we have in our family. So I told all my kids, I'm like, look, I'm on Spotify. I
That's
felt
so
so proud.
amazing. Yeah, it really makes a difference. I had a friend actually a number of years ago where she said there's certain books where she goes to the audiobook because of the language, because she wants to hear the way it ought to be said. And that
Yeah.
really stuck with me. And I think
Yeah.
as I was getting into this book, I thought, I want to hear that. And I didn't know if you had recorded it. So I went looking to see, is there an audio version? So I would highly recommend that as well. But so I feel a little daunted sharing from that passage, but it hit me to speak to that place where I think our listeners are, which is on their own healing journeys with their families, with their stories, with their lived experiences, and how there can be a good kind of hard that takes them on
Mhm.
these types of journeys. And I just want to hear so much about where you were on the journey to come to the point of writing this book at this time in your relationship with your dad and all of the things. So start us off wherever it seems good to start off, Lisa Jo.
I just think it's important that that sentence doesn't end with saying, I want to tell you the whole story. It then adds
Mm,
that phrase, or a more whole story. And that
mhm.
little tiny phrase actually only got added in toward the end of like almost a year's worth of edits, because I realized as I was writing it, it's not the whole story. Like none of us can actually see maybe our whole story. It's hard to
True.
get our mind around it. And so my idea was it's a more whole story, at least I can offer. Like I'm trying to see the whole of this character who is my dad and the whole
Mhm.
of who I was as a child to an adult with this relationship with him. But I think I realized the best I can do is a more whole story. Like I'm not
Yeah.
sure it's the whole story, but
Yeah.
yeah, I guess the short version is I am from South Africa originally, and South Africa is the place that has shaped me the most in my life. And my father is the person who has shaped me the most. So, in that way, he's kind of my origin story. He's my country of origin. He himself is. I like to think of it
Yes.
that way. But you know, for any of us who had complicated parents growing up, you don't know that as a child. It is
Mhm.
just that is the land I'm from, you know? So if you're from Texas, you just think everybody has, you know, very humid, hot summers. Or if you're from Alaska, you assume people are just constantly dealing with snow as a child. So what I grew
Yeah.
up with was the climate and temperature that I knew. I didn't know different. So I grew up with a father who has a very passionate personality. I describe him in this book. He's a little bit like an Indiana Jones type, you know? He was like a pioneer meets Indiana Jones meets Buffalo Bill. I feel like he
Yeah.
just kind of like this real, like, sort of front runners pilgrim energy. He would have been one of those people on an ox wagon for sure, like, you know, taking
Yes.
territory. That's sort of his personality. But he's a doctor by training, but he comes from South Africa's outback area. It's a pretty rough area that takes a lot to survive. Just the climate is really extreme. So he was the last child by a full decade. So the Joseph of a family of sheep
Mm,
farmers who came from this very intense climate. So he just has this passionate, driven personality that is also very explosive. So he came from a legacy of people who were pretty extreme and had very volatile expressions of however they felt. So he came from a
right.
pretty violent background. And that was just, I describe it this way, it was the language I grew up with. So South
Mhm.
Africa actually has 12 national languages. Everybody speaks several languages. But one of the languages in my house was violence. That was just a complete
Mm,
undertone to everything. And not physical violence on me, but on like punching holes in the wall and screaming and
yes.
extreme rage that you just kind of hoped wouldn't touch you physically. So, but that was completely normal. That I didn't
Right.
know to expect different. So I just, but like most parents, he was both and his passion though was like so supportive of everything I wanted to do. And I wanted to study in America. And he was the guy who made it happen. So until I became a parent myself, I don't know that I would have ever really described my dad or my childhood as being the child of an angry parent. I
Right.
realized, and there's an opening scene in the book where I am screaming at my middle son, where this thought just dropped into my mind. Oh, I am my father. Wait,
Yes.
what? And that not only that, but when I recognized that's what was happening, I chose to continue. Like I kept screaming. I like pursued that sort of violent response that I had grown up in. So
Right.
that was for me the beginning of the question of what is the story I'm in and is it
Mm.
inevitable? Because I started to see my own son who had inherited sort of my father's passionate, and I won't say violent because in a child, I would just say he's passionate, right? Big feelings,
Sure.
big
Yes.
emotions, strong will. And I realized, oh, how am I going to harness this for good and not evil? Like, how do I help him
Yes.
become the superhero and not the villain? And that really was the beginning of me trying to pull at a thread to understand the story I was in the middle of.
Like it opened up your curiosity about it. And I love
Yeah,
that question. Is it inevitable? I think
right.
that's a question that we can often feel like when we're on our own wellness journeys and trying to move through our own difficult stories. And then we begin to see those threads in our own story in somewhere. We see things from the places we have been and the people we've been with
Mhm.
showing up. And we have the opportunity that you use the phrase pull at the thread to sort of pull at that thread and see what is this about? And is there another story that I can live in relation
Mhm.
to this story that I'm living almost unconsciously in my
Right.
life? And so,
Right.
so interesting for you to start that. And then it seems to me, and this was true of a couple of other guests on our on this season, was that that question led them to want to write through their own story as their own healing, as their own rewrite, if you will, their own lens to process and come to some of their own healing and then offer that as a gift into the world. Is that fair to say that that's related to how you feel about the process as well?
Um, I think for me, the book and the healing were two different things. So, because in my father and I had such a dysfunctional relationship for so long that it took years of us navigating in a very sort of difficult ice stance. It felt like on ice that could crack at any minute,
Right.
trying to navigate that, like itself, like our relationship. And he still lives in South Africa. I live in America. I put an ocean between us. Like that's how much distance
Yeah.
I needed.
The
And
boundary for sure.
yeah, without even realizing it, right? Like as a kid, I'm
Yeah.
like, I'm going to college in America. But so it took years of work, the two of us. And I wouldn't describe that even as intentional. I didn't wake up one day and be like, Dad and I need to work through some things, right? Instead, it's
Sure.
sort of like you're raising kids and you have a husband and you have a temper, and then you realize it might come from your dad. And so there are conversations you have back and forth, navigating with one another, but never really addressing like the heart of the thing,
Mm.
but still realizing there has to be healing or growth or change. But in 2019, what sort of was then the chrysalis that became the book is that in 2019, he and I had gone through a lot by that point, a lot
Sure.
of honest and painful conversations that ended badly a lot of the time. Um, but in 2019, I was invited to come and speak for the big MOPS organization at their
Sure.
annual conference for like 4,000 moms. And they asked me if I would come and speak on what it was like to be an angry mom, to struggle with temper, because it was something I'd written about before.
Right.
And I thought about it and I was like, man, I don't know if there's anything new to even say. I feel like I've talked about it a lot. I don't mind sharing how I've struggled, how our kids push our buttons. And I was standing in the bathroom, actually brushing my teeth, kind of looking in the mirror, like my brain was wandering, thinking about this. And out of the ether, I mean, I feel like the only way I can describe it is like something from God to my brain, because it was so outside of me, came
Right.
this thought: you should talk about what it was like to be the child of an angry parent. And it was such a
Oh,
shocking thought to me. I literally took the toothbrush out of my mouth and like spoke out loud. And I was like, never, I will
wow.
never talk about that, because I
Wow.
knew I had never described myself that way before. And I'm
Yeah,
guessing you probably know better than me, but kids who've grown up with some kind of trauma, it's not how we choose to self-identify. Like that's
that's
not,
right.
it's very vulnerable. Like I would never want to describe myself that way.
It
But
invites a
secondly,
conversation you don't want to have a lot of
there it
times.
is.
Yes.
That's the thing.
Yeah.
I had like extreme nausea because I realized if I was going to give this talk, I would have to actually talk to my dad about it, which meant it would be the first time in our relationship I would have to say out loud these words. You were an angry parent to me. Like that's what they want me to
Yeah.
talk about. And I was like, I feel nauseous right now, actually, like
Wow.
even
Yeah.
remembering how I felt in that moment. And I just
Yeah.
thought, there's no way. Like, there's no way. Like, I think he knows that that's true, but we've
Sure.
never actually said those things out loud. Like, our
Right.
relationship works because we dance around the repercussions of that, but we don't name that we never say that out loud. We just all
Right.
have moved past it. And so I spent about a week trying to avoid the sense that I was supposed to give this talk and
Yes.
finally realized I'm going to have to talk to him. But I was like, I can't talk to him. I will leave him a voice note about this. Like, I don't know that I
Right.
can actually even have a live conversation. I left him this
Like let him
rambling
sit with
voice
it
note.
for a bit.
Yes, yes.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
and I just feel like I didn't know that I could have that conversation live. I didn't know how it would go. I didn't know if he would talk over me. The whole thing just was so stressful. I'm like, I'm just going to put it into the ether. So I left him
Yes.
this message and I was so nervous about what his response would be, but it was really amazing. And interestingly enough, I actually asked him and he gave permission for me to play a clip from his response as part of my talk, because the point I was trying to make is that change is possible and
Mm.
that I could be 50 and my dad can be 77, and we are still managing to heal things that happened when I was 18. Like it isn't too
Yes.
late. You actually can create like dramatic healing,
Hmm.
no matter how old you are, if both parties are engaged. And so he left me this message back and he had just said, whatever there might be in my life that might
Hmm.
help somebody else, like you are welcome to use it. And it was so
Wow.
surprising to me. And so that was the beginning of the seed of the idea that opened the door to me writing a whole book. Because at the time, I thought it was a one off, like I'm going to do this really scary thing. My dad gave me permission and then it's done. And
Right.
I never even watched, like they had recorded the talks, they have all their keynotes
Sure.
available online and they had sent it to me and said I could share it with my audience. And I had shared it, but I've never watched it. I didn't even want to like relive the experience of telling that
Wow.
story. And
So vulnerable.
I tell the story that I told from the stage is a story that's like one of the centerpieces of the book. I won't say what it is on the podcast, but it's something my father said to me the night before my baptism. And it was
Right.
so terrible and so shocking. And it's funny
Hmm.
how like words like that can stay with you, like into your
Yes.
adulthood. And so I told that story from the stage, and it was like you could hear a pin drop. It was dead silence.
Wow.
And then I was able to say, but like, here's the thing, like about God, because if you are the parent who fears you've done that to your kid, the hope is this ongoing relationship. The fact that it's just not too late and it doesn't have to happen all at once. It's not like this big come to Jesus. It's like this ongoing willingness to slowly listen and hear and change. And so that has been my hope with this book, to offer the story of my dad and me as just sort of a living testimony that it's not too late.
Yeah. And I think that's so important too, because the healing journey in whether it's within ourselves or in our relationships, I often say it takes the time it takes.
Yeah.
There isn't
Yes.
a specific timeline, and there's a lot of nuance in that conversation, and there's a lot of complexity. And we can't compress that into a couple of therapy sessions and we're
Right.
through our
Right.
childhood generational trauma. Like these
I
are life,
wish.
right? Man, I could be making a lot of money, Lisa Joe, if I had that miracle 2 session
I
where
know.
you're good to go. But it is, I mean, we long for that because we are living in our bodies these stories that we carry,
Yes. Yeah.
and it's not far from us, even if we're not
Mm.
consciously aware of it. So it is an important journey, but it's a spacious one. It doesn't have to, and it often doesn't resolve quickly. And sometimes for some people, it doesn't resolve on both sides of that relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And that
Right.
they're, like you were saying with your dad's willingness and where he was in his life in those older years as compared to where he was as you write about him in those early years. You talk
Mm-hmm.
about how, he speaks to how he was not the same parent to you as he
Mm-hmm.
is to your step siblings, and
Yeah.
how he grieves that. And he
Mm-hmm.
has his own insights in how it was for you because of the story he's living now. And then he begins on his story, and how both of you are able to come together at this
Mm-hmm.
point in time,
Mm-hmm.
imperfectly, with
Right.
a more whole story, but
Right.
with a different kind of hope, not just because of where you are, but where he is also. And
Right.
so I do think that's a really interesting thing for people to think about. Um, I love that you don't um, tie things up with like a nice, neat, and tidy bow, as if
Mm.
it's just this sort of toxic positivity, or even
Right.
this spiritual
Right.
bypassing vibe that's so
Yeah.
prevalent and really not real. And so I think when I'm describing the book to people, because of course, as I'm reading, I'm telling everyone, please get this book and read this book. It's so great. And the enjoyment, I'll just take a little moment to say the enjoyment of the craft of it, like the writing itself is just so beautiful. And then it's the story within that writing. It's really unique because people can write and have beautiful things to say, but then to have as an English teacher background turned therapist, the appreciation for the craft of writing. I mean, it's tremendous in this. And so it's so moving. You enter into the story, and, some of the horror and some of the feelings, again, I'm someone with whom it's difficult, apart from art, to come to my own feelings. And so when
Huh.
writing is entering us into that, or poetry or music, um, enters us into that, we get into a feeling space, and that's so much of the healing. So we resonate with that. We touch down to our hearts. There's such a beautiful way that your book does that, but it really speaks to all of the work that you had done individually, all of the pieces of where your dad was to say, yes, this story is available to you, and I will participate with you in the writing of that in a way that will help other people. I mean, it's it's beautiful. It's a miracle, really.
It's the biggest plot twist of my life. Yes, but I
Yes.
want to I want to encourage the listener who's like, "Well, that must be nice for you that worked out, that your dad like came
Mm,
around," and say this. So I'm glad you experienced it like a movie. That is how I wanted it to feel when you read it.
mm,
That there's like this epic story that sweeps from like the outbacks of South Africa to Washington, D.C. and throws in some Ghana and Ukraine on the way. And my
yes.
dad is this like interesting character. And but in the, some of the final chapters of the book where I'm going home and he and I are having this wonderful homecoming moment and there's reconciliation, I paused to have sort of a flashback to years previous where this thing my dad had said to me that was so terrible that like I just
Mm,
could not get past it. Um, and I at the time wasn't able to talk to him about it as an adult. Like I didn't, how do you bring those things up? Like you don't
mm,
even want to acknowledge that they happened. They're so awful. And so
mm,
before my dad and I were deeply reconciled, before I felt like he saw my side, before he was like open, before he had changed as much as he had, there were really hard years of just sitting with these like painful wounds that you're
mm,
not sure what to do with. And so I want to encourage the listener that if that's you, like you will find yourself in this book because I tell that story,
mm.
like what it was like to sit there with this pain. And I think this
Yeah.
is the power of believing in a God who actually is present with us, like in our worst
Hmm.
moments, because there's something so vital. And I know therapists practice this with patients, whether it's like writing a letter to your childhood self, or
Sure.
I'd had a therapist do these different exercises with me. And I felt like I was able to sit in the moment and say to Jesus, like, look at this terrible thing that happened. Like, this was
Hmm.
so bad and so painful. And
Hmm.
then receive his response as if he was responding the way I wish my dad had responded. And
Yes.
it was so, so powerful. Like, even if my
Mm,
dad had never come to a place where he had been able to see and hear my story
mm,
in the way he does now, I will say, like, that moment proved to me that it isn't too late. So even if you have a parent who's passed away, and I do, like my mom passed away,
yes.
the ability of God, who is outside of time and life and death, like to
Hmm.
step into our most painful stories and like bear witness, validate, and then actually
Yeah.
respond like the way you wish a parent had responded has been for
Yeah.
me part of what's been so powerful about the writing of this book, because
Right.
the faith element has been this piece of the puzzle for me, at least, in trying to make sense of a more whole story, which
Yes.
I don't think I could have done just with my dad,
Right.
regardless.
Yeah. The hopefulness of the work, like you're saying, before even the possibility of hope or
Mm,
reconciliation in the space between the two of you, there was this
yes.
internal space that you were
Yes.
working through with God, with
Right.
others who were supporting you, I'm sure, friends and
Yes.
therapists, leaders,
Yes.
your partner, that, and those were good, hard journeys to go on. I guess I would
Hmm.
say, that even, I
Yeah.
love that even if it didn't come to this point of reconciliation, that work was healing for you.
Right. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. And there's a messiness in the middle of these things.
So messy, so
Yes.
messy. And so in the middle of your life, too, right? Like, nobody
Yes.
has like 3 months to take off from their life to solve their childhood wounds. Like, you still are like putting gas in the car, and the kids feel like there's
Taking,
nothing to eat, no matter how much food is in the fridge. Like that is
yes.
like your life still. And so
Yes.
I have just found, I guess the way I describe it is this: it's kind of like there's this back room that we all have, and we just shove
Hmm.
like pain and things we don't really think about, and like trauma, and
Yes.
it just like that messy closet, like I think about Monica on Friends. Even pristine Monica had like this insane
That's
closet she shoved things into. We all
totally.
have a closet like that, and
Yeah.
I felt like, for me, and this is what I encourage people to do, is I felt like the Lord was saying to me when I gave that talk, and then when I started to think about writing this book, he wasn't saying to me, hey, you've got this disaster closet, you need to clean that out. He wasn't, that's too much. Like, that bar is too
Yeah. It's
high.
overwhelming.
It's too much. All he said to me was this: will you just acknowledge that there is a closet? Like, just,
Right.
can you just look at it? Like, let's just look at it together. And so
Yeah.
that's always my encouragement to people. Like, I'm not asking you in this book to go unpack like your most painful things, the things you don't even think about. I'm just saying, can you just acknowledge they exist? Like, just that
Yeah.
they're there, because that's the beginning. And it
Yeah.
felt to me like that moment when I was brushing my teeth, and I felt like the Holy Spirit said to me, you need to talk about what it was like to be the child of an angry parent. That
Hmm.
was him asking me, can you just look at the closet? Like,
Hmm.
let's just stop pretending it's not there. And
Right.
I felt like I was having almost like a Hogwarts experience of going through the secret platform door. Like, I
Right.
was like, wait, what door? What closet? What are you?
Right.
I've never seen
Nine
that
and three
before.
quarters or
Like,
whatever it is.
yes,
Right.
yes.
Yes.
I was like so shocked. I was like shocked that someone else would even know there was a closet in my life that I don't
Right.
look at. So that's always my encouragement. There's real spiritual power in simply acknowledging it. And
Hmm.
then you'd be surprised how gently God sort of slowly at your pace
Hmm.
stands
Hmm.
there with you until you're ready to open it, and then is with you when you turn the light on, and is with you when you take the first thing out. And so for me, 2019, that talk was sort of acknowledging the closet. Even though my dad and I had started trying to repair relationship and had in many stages a great relationship, but when I looked at the closet, the next 5 years then of me writing the book were me working through the closet, is how I would describe it. And that's how long
Yes.
it took. Like, it took a really long time, because I was writing the book, but then I would have to have conversations with my dad and with my brothers, and cry a lot to my husband and
Yes,
be
I bet.
mad, and
Yeah.
then change the laundry, like all of
And
everything
right.
together.
And probably write a whole bunch of stuff that, as we do when we write, ends up not going anywhere in the book, but it had to come
Yeah.
out in order to get to the
Yeah.
stuff that lands in the book. And just,
Yeah.
it's interesting. I think an analogy I use with my clients sometimes when we're dealing with processing trauma is that your stories can be books on your bookshelf, and you can put them up for a time and know they're there, and you can take them down and sit them in your lap for one sentence, one
Mm.
page. Then you can close them and put them back up, and you get to decide sort of when and you're pacing for how you want to make your way through that story
Mm-hmm.
and how much you can tolerate and
Mm-hmm.
dealing with, because trauma, of course, is, even as you were describing, thinking about that moment of having to, basically ask your dad, is it all right if I go there
Mm-hmm.
with our
Mm-hmm.
relationship? And even now there's a physiological response that you're
Right.
navigating, and your book's out in the world. And so,
Right.
for people who are working through these things, it's still with us.
Mm-hmm.
And so we are gentle with ourselves in the process.
Mm-hmm.
And as you're saying, God is gentle with us. And maybe it's one piece of paper that comes out of that closet. I was thinking also of
Right.
the pervasive junk drawer. Everyone has a junk
Yes.
drawer. Lord knows
Yes.
what's in the bottom of that, but we all have one.
Right.
And so
Right.
in order to clean that out, it really is one key, one elastic band, one old
Right.
do a tag at a
One thing at a
time,
time.
right?
Yes. One thing
And
at a time.
just letting ourselves be in process and
Mm-hmm.
acknowledging, as you say, that this is concurrent with ongoing everyday life that needs us. And so we can't escape the duality of that, right?
Right.
We're living these stories that we are carrying with us that maybe need some more attention and care, but we also are making supper and going to
Right.
basketball practice and
Right.
and doing the things. And so that's a really honest way to think about the journey. So
Mm.
I would love, if you're comfortable, talking a little bit about sort of trauma. And one of the themes in the book, I love how you merge this with South Africa, on its own as its own character in some ways, but then
Mm.
also
Mm-hmm.
within your own family, looking at how your dad had a story before he was your dad, and then you have
Right.
your story, and really looking at that generational piece. I would love to hear you just talk a bit about that and maybe what you would want to say to listeners or readers about those generational pieces of the story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things my dad said to me when I started writing this book is he said, I'm worried you're going to put me in a box. Like I'm going to just be this like cartoon or this caricature in a box. And I said to him, actually, it's the writing of the story and getting to learn from you so much about your childhood that has taken you out of the box for me. I think for most of my life, you did live in this very small box of this extreme caricature, but it was in getting to know him and the generations before him that helped me have a better picture. And so it was really important to me in this book that he not appear like the villain or the hero, that both of us are both and like
That's
all of
right.
us have both of those things inside of us.
Mm-hmm.
But so often it's easy to just look at ourselves in isolation, particularly here in the West, like in America, like the sense of the individual is the main character in the story.
Yes.
And but from sort of the southern part of the world, which is a much more communal environment, and families and generations are where stories really live, not in individuals. I
Mm-hmm.
think in the Christian faith is the same. Like God describes himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Like there are three generations. And then when you're familiar with
Yes.
those stories, you understand like what Abraham did affected Isaac and Jacob. Like
That's
there's
right.
no in isolation. Or take it to more pragmatic scientific place. When you go to the doctor, they give you those forms and they ask you to fill out like on both sides of your family tree, what did you inherit from your father, from your mother, from your
Mm-hmm.
aunts and uncles, maternal, paternal, because we recognize like those things actually affect our bodies now.
That's
So
right.
that's how I've started to look at trauma or pain or hurt or dysfunction. Like we inherit those things. So to the
Mm.
degree that we have that each generation has healed or done the work is what we then pass on to the next one. So we aren't just these islands as much as sometimes the American mindset wants you to think that you
Sure.
are in it on your own. We're not. So as individuals, we are related to a bigger story, but we are also on a national level related to like a bigger story of humanity as well.
Hmm.
So for me, a lot of it was decoding that. Like, where did my dad come from? What did growing up under apartheid mean in South Africa? How did it affect how I saw the world? How did it affect how I
Right.
understood my place in the world as a white person? You know, what did it mean if I traveled to Ghana and what I saw there versus what I saw in Maryland? And just
Mm-hmm.
understanding that, I grew up under apartheid, so this terrible injustice that we were like that was institutionalized, right,
Right.
in our government. This horror that we grew up under. And so I often felt like I wanted to be a human rights lawyer because I wanted to be on the right side of the equation. Like, here's the bad guys, like them out there, and here's the good guys, us over here. But
Right.
what I realized, and same with my dad, like he was the bad guy, I was the good guy, is how I saw myself. But what we learn, of course, is that we all have both and in us,
Hmm.
good and bad. We are capable of great evil and great good. We live on both
Hmm.
sides of the equation. We are
Hmm.
part of a human story. As much as we might want to say, I'm the good guy, historically or
Hmm.
racially or however you think of it, the truth is we've all inherited things like
That's right.
back in our DNA and in our stories historically. And so until we're willing to see ourselves clearly, we can't really see other people well. And so
Hmm.
a large part of this book is that the act of being willing to intentionally see. And I have this story in the middle where I describe this amazing Zulu human rights lawyer. I was traveling through South Africa with him, and he told me, like, roll down your window, like, look out, like, look and see what has happened to my people. And I
Yes.
just have kept that metaphor. Like, are we willing to actually not just zip through history or family
Hmm.
or culture or headlines, but like, are we willing to like roll down the window, look, see, understand?
Yes.
And that's what helps us become more human too. Like, that's what helps
Hmm.
us step fully into our humanity when we're willing
Hmm.
to see where our stories have intersected with the stories of others for good
Hmm.
and for bad.
And for healing, I would say too, in the
Yes,
sense of,
that's why.
when we become too insular, and we see this in a
Hmm.
lot of mental health challenges, where people, as a consequence of the crises they're in or the experiences they've had, they're very much, inwardly focused, very
Mm.
self-centered in the most understanding of ways, because it
Yeah,
feels that the world is imploding for
right.
them. But as they heal and they begin to look out and connect with others and be in community and have conversations, they realize that there is more to this story, and I don't exist in this vacuum. And it's
Right.
important to have that dialogue and input. And we definitely have. I don't know that it's that different here in Canada. There are some differences certainly, but we definitely have a very dichotomous way of wanting to homogenize groups, wanting to say it's like an us versus them kind of
Hmm.
dichotomous approach. And that does not invite conversation, and it
Right.
doesn't invite
Right.
growth, and it doesn't invite possibility for something to actually be healed or different. And so
Hmm.
I think that you do a beautiful job of that in inviting people into the honesty, but all in looking inward and the looking outward,
Mm.
and seeking to just sit with that and
Yeah.
understand it, and let it seep into the heart space, not just the headline. Or that's the power of story, of course, is that
Mm.
it's it's not just a headline, it's not just a news report. There's this common humanity that comes forward,
Hmm.
and that
Hmm.
you can enter into it and understand from a different lens. It's a different kind of movement and voice in that space than just how people want to pit it one way or the other in the media. And so I think, and I know you speak about that in how you've tried to handle the historical context with that honesty and grace and respect and so on throughout. And it's really it's really moving and helpful, I think, and invitational to those conversations, which I think we need more of that in general in our lives. So So I would love to talk just a little bit before we wrap up about what you would maybe want to say to the person specifically around that rage. So, that download that you got with your toothbrush that said you need to talk about being a child of an angry parent, and then your own experience of seeing that anger come up in your parenting. What would you want to say to the person who's had either or both of those experiences, and maybe how reading your book might help them?
Mm. Um, well, I hope that you just feel seen in the book, that there is a sense in which that you're not alone in this experience, whether you're navigating what's come toward you or you're trying to manage your own feelings. But I think one of the things I've learned over the years is this idea that you can have all of these big feelings, but you can also have control over them. And so I grew up in a household that modeled a total lack of control, as if anger is
Mm,
unable to be controlled. That when it
right.
comes out, this is just its natural state. Like you must just receive what is coming your way, especially when it was couched in sort of this very weird righteous anger. Like my dad
Mm,
is this strong pastor type, was like, I feel righteous anger towards you, so you deserve
just
this.
take
Like,
it. And this
let's
is
take
how,
it.
yes.
Yeah. Yes. And so, what I have learned that's actually really empowering, and my dad has learned, interesting, separately from me, and I've heard conversations with him about it, is that anger is something that we can control. It is something
Mm,
that we can exercise discipline over, and that we can shape how and when it comes out and what we do with it. That it isn't just this flood that we can't stop, like that we actually
right.
do have power and autonomy over our own emotions, and we are able to regulate them. And so self-regulation was something that was never modeled for me. Like I didn't know that that was a thing. We didn't even have those words when I was growing up. I mean,
Sure.
that's so new. But what we would call self-regulation, like we just it was basically just like a free for all. Like whatever you felt, you were just, if you were my dad, were allowed to just express it. If you were a
Release it into
child,
the world.
you were
Yeah.
not allowed to. So
Yeah.
yeah, that it was actually really hopeful and empowering for me to realize, oh, it's not like I have to stop feeling angry. Like it's not like an
Hmm.
off switch that I have, but I can recognize, like a pressure builder, how it starts to build. What are my signals that I'm experiencing anger? And then what are my releases? Like what are healthy ways to deal with it? And that the
Hmm.
anger, actually, this is the phrase we use with my kids when they were little, like your anger doesn't have to be the boss of you. You can
Right.
be the boss of your anger. And so
Yes.
that was really empowering for me to learn. And I hope that the book shows that. And it's not, this is not a therapy book. It's not going to give you the one, two, three. This isn't a teaching book. It's a showing book through
Mm,
my life, through my dad's life, through the changes that we've experienced in how we parent our own kids, how he parents his next generation of kids. That there's just so much hope in that, in knowing that
hmm.
we aren't defined, also that we're not defined by our worst parenting day. Like that isn't who we
That's
are
right.
forever as a
That's
parent.
right.
And it's not who we are forever as a child. That there is the power to step outside of our timelines and to revisit like really painful parts of our lives and rewrite those stories, like to pull apart the thread, to restitch it. Sometimes if it's a really wonderful opportunity with a parent, but sometimes not. Like sometimes as a
Hmm.
faith exercise or a therapy exercise, we actually
Hmm.
can pull apart, restitch. And then what we did, like weirdly, like then affects our present. Like I'm so
Hmm.
astonished every time that happens in my life, this traveling back somewhere, repairing. And then the me in the now receives the benefit of that somehow. It's like the weirdest kind of time
Yes.
travel that is actually possible.
Yes. And I think about that, and I think that when you are um on a healing journey, there's often a shame about not knowing, right? There's
Yeah,
often a shame that comes in, like, why do I feel like I can't control my anger? Why don't I know? And I think it's
right.
great what you've named there, which is it was not modeled for me.
Right.
And
Had
no
no
one
frame of
taught me.
reference. Yeah.
And so how until someone can come alongside, or you can do some self-directed research in that topic and say, what are people saying about how to handle anger and how to deal with that? And what are other people doing and learning? There's no shame in needing to find those tools. And I think from a therapy standpoint, I see that a lot in my office where people come in and expect that they know how to have healthy relationships, or they know how to be gentle parent, or they know how, all these things. It's like, well, how would you know that? How would you have learned that
Right.
if it wasn't
Right.
modeled for you? And that's okay for you to be where you are. It's actually very understandable that,
Right. In the same,
yeah, go ahead.
I always say, in the same way that violence was a language that I learned in my household, love is its own language that has to be learned. And so,
Mm-hmm.
when you're surrounded by native speakers, it's easier to learn it. But if you haven't been, you got to give yourself some grace, because you have to sort of change whatever your native tongue was that was modeled in your home to
Mm-hmm.
learning this new one. And so, yeah, for anyone who's learned a language, that can be tricky. But when you're surrounded by native speakers, that's when it becomes easier. So moving yourself into those communities, whatever they look like, if it's a faith community or a therapy community or a friendship community, like wherever it is that they have the language you're trying to learn, move
Mm.
into it, because then we learn it faster that way.
Oh, I love that. And the hopefulness is you
Yes,
can
you
come
can.
from a heritage
Absolutely.
of
Yes.
violence, and you can learn the language of love.
Yes,
And
you really
that's
can.
amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this conversation has been just a delight and so rich, and I know it will resonate with our listeners. And I'm just so thrilled that we've been able to have it. I really can't recommend the book enough. I do want to just land in this season. We've been asking the same question to all of our guests who come towards the end, because we know, and I can see behind you that this is true, that all of our writers are also readers, and we have what we affectionately call our bedside book stack, which
Mm.
is what is piling up beside your bed. What are some of the titles that you might find in that bedside book stack that are encouraging you, that are, and this could be any genre, not specific to, health and wellness or spirituality, but what are the things that are in that bedside book stack for you, Lisa Jo?
That's a hard one for me. I have hundreds and hundreds of books, but
Yes.
I'm kind of in a weird rereading phase right now. I think it's because I've had a book launching and there's a lot going on. And so books are like comfort food to me. I tend to go back to
Yes.
the ones that like are really comforting for me. So one of my favorite fiction authors, she's Canadian, Louise Penny, is like my
Yes.
all-time favorite. Her mysteries are so wonderful. And I love her because her characters, she always describes it this way, like they're not murder stories per se. They're about like why a murder would be something you feel is the only thing. She talks about how murder is
Yes.
something that's been festering for years. So I would say it's like those feelings that haven't ever found a place to resolve. You've never learned a new language. Like you're just sitting in that toxic language of your childhood. And so
Yes.
I love her because of how she decodes people and our behaviors. So that's
So
just
interesting.
a really powerful thing for me. There's another book I'm reading that's more of a spiritual discipline exercise. It's called The Daily Office. It's not the TV show, but it's
Yes.
like these
Also good,
little,
but not in the bedside book
also
stack.
good, yes.
Yes.
But like it's kind of like a pause, morning, midday, and
Yes.
evening to reflect and pray and read some scripture. And that's been really good for me. I tend
Mm.
to I'm aware of my childhood, like leftover habits of anxiety or control or wanting to please people or to sort of mold myself in to fit with other people so I don't feel anxious or I can take on other people's
Mm.
anxieties as my own. And so this is just a really great way to remind myself, like, oh, wait, I'm not in control, not because I'm not big enough or strong enough, but because that's not my job. Like there's a God who
Right. This
loves
doesn't
me.
belong to
Like,
me.
yes, like he
Yeah.
has got it. I'm okay. I have to say, gosh, this is just like a little bonus thing that struck me so much. There's this whole section in this book called Looking Back to Go Forward. And it's all about dealing with like past trauma and pain in order to move forward. It was very
Hmm.
appropriate for me during book launch season. But he talks about this like childhood Sunday school story we've all heard a million times about Joseph and how, he was his many colored coat. And he reminds me of my dad always so much and how his siblings hated him. And all the stuff that happens in his life. And then, yay, God fixed everything. But what this little book has done is like really in each reading, deep dive Joseph's trauma. Like I've never heard anyone
Yes.
call it that, like what his trauma would have been like. And that when he is
Mhm.
confronted by his siblings again, he has this hysterical weeping that I feel like the Sunday school people just like breeze
Yeah.
past that. But this book really sat in that. Like he wept and
Yes.
wept because he had actual trauma. Like they had done
Mm.
terrible,
That's
terrible
right.
things to him. And he was in
Hmm.
real pain because of it. And then the writer says, but he must have been doing a lot of work with the Lord over the intervening years because he's able to
Hmm.
approach them from this place, kind of what we talked about with a new language, like this language of
Hmm.
love and forgiveness, that
Hmm.
isn't just he isn't just putting it under the carpet what happened. Like he is clearly like it was a painful wound in his life that he has received healing from. And it
Yes.
was so helpful for me to look at that character that I feel like is portrayed in this sort of Disney-esque version
Well, Andrew
when
Lloyd Webber,
really
you know,
I know his life
it's
was horrific. And
yeah.
yeah, and what it would have taken to actually process that to be able to
Hmm.
forgive. So weirdly, that's also on my stack.
Wow, that's great. So that well, we as we always do in the show notes, we like to include what people are recommending for that because we have a bookshop here at the center and we feature lots of great books, but we are also lovers of reading and collectors of books. I love that analogy of collecting books like fine wines that you don't feel like you have to read
Mm,
them right away, but when the right time
yes,
comes, you can pull that one
I
off the
love
shelf and enjoy.
that.
Yeah,
I haven't
so
heard that before.
oh
That's
really?
great. Yes.
Yes, it allows me to have my addiction, Lisa Joe, and I can keep. That's the thing. That's the story I tell myself, so that when I'm buying more books for the books I haven't read, it's okay because they're just going in the wine cellar for the right
That
time
is
and it's collecting.
great.
Yeah, I
I
love
love
that.
it.
So definitely you're going to want to have Lisa Joe's book. I don't think you're going to be able to leave it in the wine cellar. You're going to want to read it, but it's definitely one to pick up. And we'd be glad to introduce you to that if this is your first introduction to Lisa Joe's work. I'm thrilled to be the person to invite you to read it. And for those of you who maybe have listened to this, and we are talking about things like trauma and generational historical, really difficult things. And we're wading into that. And it may be that you're listening and there's points of intersection and you realize that you are on your own healing journey in your own family. And we would want you to have support. And so we are here at Covey Wellness Center to help. We want to be able to support people who are on the journey. And so we want you to know that there are people available to walk with you through those spaces and help you to move towards healing and hope. And so I've loved the picture and the arc of that story here today that we've been able to talk about. So thanks again so much, Lisa Joe. I do hope this is the first and not the last conversation we will have. And I just so appreciate your time and I'm so thrilled. And just please keep writing these beautiful books.
Thank you for having me.
You are so welcome.